All right, y'all. It's been a minute, but we are back. This is the 2024 release of the Kannon Studios Podcast. We've been on a huge break for about 6 or more months, and we are back. So just an update, right? Like, we had this momentum going with the podcast, and due to that, I had an influx of clients come, and we were slam packed with clients. And so because of trying to balance our own internal content and making sure that clients' work was also being produced, we had to put our podcast on the back burner, which is oftentimes what business owners do. We put our own marketing on the back burner. And so now I am taking my own medicine, and I am committed to at minimum 52 episodes of the Kannon Studios Podcast in 2024. So let's go. Y'all ready to do this? Week after week, I'm going to try to drop some value and hope that you would implement at least just a little piece with me together, because we're on this together, y'all. I'm in that same consistency struggle that I always talk about. And so this year is no longer the year of excuses. This is the year of consistency and providing value and showing why you're an expert. It's no longer us thinking we're the experts. It's you stepping into your expertise and telling other people about it. So 2024 is here. Actually, as I'm filming this, 2024 is around the corner. It's not quite 2024 yet, but it's almost here, whether you want it to be or not. And so 2023 for a lot of people, including myself, has been the hardest year for a multiple number of reasons. But you know what? God kept us. If you're listening to this and you can hear this, then God still has a purpose for you. And so we've been here since January 1st, 2023. And hopefully God lets us see January 1st, 2024. So if you're listening to this, just know that he has something planned for you. So let's get into it. Let's get into the first episode of the Kannon Studios Podcast for 2024. How to start your podcast this year, okay? How to start your podcast this year. Let's go. All right. Listen, guys, last year y'all said y'all were going to start a podcast. In 2023, you said you were going to start a podcast, or maybe not even a podcast. Maybe you just said you were going to be more consistent at content. And life just got in the way. Things happened at home personally. Maybe things happened in business, for the good, for the bad. Through all of it, there's been learning experiences. But you know that you said this time last year, you wanted to become more consistent at content. I'm speaking directly to myself right now. So don't think that I'm fussing at anybody that's listening to this. I'm fussing at myself. I'm just letting y'all into my inner thoughts. So last year we said, this time last year, we were going to be more consistent with content. And so 2024 is the year of consistency. And I want to be able to help you do that. So regardless of whether you choose to utilize Kannon Studios at all, or just start here on the podcast, I want to be a resource to help you be more consistent with your content in 2024, because I truly believe, and I know, and it's proven, that it will not only help your business grow, but more importantly, it will help you grow as a person. And so that's what 2024 is going to be about. So today we're going to break down how to plan to launch or relaunch your podcast in just a few short minutes. All right. let's jump right into this thing. So, number one, whenever you are planning to launch a podcast, the first thing you have to understand is, who are you speaking to? I know we hear this time and time and time and time and time, and it's time again, right? But you have to understand who you're speaking to. And I'm not just talking about demographics. I'm talking about, what do these people like? Where do they drink coffee at? Right? Where do they shop at? What are their podcast listening behaviors? What do they like to do on the weekends? Like, you have to get almost kind of creepy specific about who it is that you're speaking to. Because if you come out and you're speaking or you're launching a podcast and it's so general, nobody's going to get any value from it. It cannot be super general. This is the year where you have to get intentionally specific about who you are trying to help. For me and for Kannon Studios, when we first came out, we were trying to help everybody, but it took us almost 2 years to figure out who exactly do we want to help. And here's who we want to help. And here's who this podcast is for. Our podcast is for, and Kannon Studios is for, and is ready to serve successful business owners or successful business leaders that have a wealth of knowledge and need somewhere to place that expertise. Right? So those are business owners, successful business leaders, right? Or a combination of both, that have a wealth of knowledge, but they have nowhere for that knowledge to live. It's all in their head. And they are now at the space where they've been in that game for a while. They're experts in their field, and they're trying to figure out, what can I do with that knowledge? How can I pivot? How can I help somebody else? Because they're probably having conversations, and at the end of those conversations, people find so much value in what it is that they're saying. They're like, man, I wonder how many more people this would help. So if you don't get super specific about who it is that your podcast is for, you're not going to reach anybody. They may listen for the first few episodes, but then they're just going to die off because the information is so general that it's generally helping them, which means that it's not solving a specific problem. So that is number one. You have to determine who you're speaking to and creating this podcast for. Get inside the mind of the exact person you're speaking to. I know that the person that I want to work with, the most important thing to them is time. How can they maximize the time that they have? Because they're busy. They're running a successful business or a successful company, right? They're a leader. They're constantly their time is needing to be in this place, in this place, in this place. They don't have time to sit down and create content. They don't have time to do that at all. So I want to make sure that I'm speaking to them to say, hey, even if you only have 30 minutes a month to create content, I want to show you how to do that. Whether that's coming into the studio or whether that's you doing it at home with your cell phone. I want to be the resource that helps you create that content consistently, because that is the one thing that is going to live on forever, is your content. And so it's helping so many people, right? You need to create a customer persona based on this person that you're wanting to speak to. So I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier. It's not just the demographics, it's the psychographics, it's the problems, hobbies, listening behaviors, etc. If you don't know where to start with that, I would encourage you to go and Google and look up StoryBrand's framework on how to create a customer persona. That is a good framework for you to start at, and a good framework for you to begin to get comfortable and understand and know who you are really best fit to serve in your podcast. Okay? This is the most important part of planning your podcast, really. Do not launch a podcast. Do not relaunch your podcast if you don't know who you're specifically speaking to. Okay? Number 2, planning the podcast content. Now, a lot of people think this is the most important part. It's not. The first step is the most important part, understanding who you're speaking to, because that is going to literally drive everything that you do. So number 2, once you've figured out who you are specifically talking to, you want to plan that podcast content. So you need to define your core themes and topics. Okay, so this should be at the intersection of the person, your ideal client or your ideal listener's problems, and the solution that your podcast brings. How are you positioned to be a solution? And those need to drive your core themes and topics. The topics are not always going to be things that are most popular, but your job as a communicator on this podcast is to make things that may seem antiquated or things that may not be relevant right now communicate those things and communicate those things that may be old, right? That aren't trending right now. Communicate those things to your audience in a way that presents value and expertise. And so that is what is going to drive the core theme and topics of what it is that your podcast should be about. Once again, this is all driving from that first step in defining who your ideal listener or who are you creating this podcast for. So every single episode that I plan to release is going to be targeted towards that successful business owner or that successful business leader that has a wealth of knowledge but does not have a hub for all that knowledge to live. And so they need to create a podcast. That is something that doesn't take a lot of time for them. Right? Because their number one obstacle is time. The second obstacle is not knowing where to even start. But the first obstacle is time for them, right? So that is what all of my topics and the core theme of this podcast is going to be about. The second part of planning the podcast content is you need to develop the episode structure and format. So what I mean by that is the structure is just simply the structure, like an outline. You have your intro, then you have the meat of the actual podcast. Maybe at some point you have some ads thrown into the podcast. Maybe you have like a little break. Maybe there's an intermission. However you want to structure it, that's up to you. And just know, don't get so stuck on the structure of the podcast because it's probably going to change. But the only way for you to know to change it is by starting. Okay? So that is the second portion of planning the podcast content. And then the format. Is this going to be a solo podcast? Is this going to be a podcast with you and a guest? Are you going to be interviewing people? Are you going to have a Q&A? Are you going to have other experts on? Maybe it's a combination of all of those things. This specific podcast is going to be a combination of all of those things. So there's going to be some episodes where it's just me. Episodes where I bring in experts that's relevant to whatever topic we're talking about. It's going to be a combination of all of those things for me. And so I want to do all of those things, whatever 3 formats I choose consistently, so I know what's working and what's not. Once you have that, you want to outline the format for each episode. So that helps with topic creation and just the overall flow of the podcast. One thing you don't want to do is show up to the podcast and you're just talking and just talking. I know a lot of us, especially people that have been in their industries for a while, like to wing it. But when you wing it, you don't ever land the plane, right? And then you end up saying the same thing over and over and over again. So I have an outline right here on my computer that I'm following. And it's not that I couldn't just speak about all this information, but there may be some things that I miss and there wouldn't be any structure. So outlining each episode is super helpful. And then the last part of number 2 is create a content calendar. It can be something simple. It can literally be a Google sheet that has the recording date, the podcast publishing date, the date that you plan to publish the podcast, the episode title, show notes, what platform you plan to release the podcast on, and then any notes about the show. So how I have my content calendar planned out is right here. It's in Google Sheets. Honestly, I was trying to get something that was like aesthetically pleasing and it became too overwhelming. And I didn't want that to be a hurdle and something that blocked me from being able to get this content out. So I just created my own Google Sheet. Right now it has recording date, episode title, if there's going to be a guest, release date, status, and then notes. And the notes is basically, it links to the Google Doc that has all of my information about that specific episode. So for example, for this one, it's how to start a podcast in 2024. And then my notes links to a Google Doc that has this entire outline that I'm using to create this content right now. So that's how simple it can be. Number 3, connecting with listeners. So the only way that you can connect with your listeners is by understanding who you're talking to and like really getting into the mind of them. And so without doing and taking time for number 1, it's going to be hard for any of these things to follow because you're just going to be throwing spaghetti at the wall essentially. And you're in a sense, when you're doing marketing, at some point when you're first starting out, you are throwing spaghetti at the wall, and I get that. But you still need to have, if you're an expert in your field, you still need to have a clear idea of who it is that you're speaking to, regardless of the tactics that you're using to speak to them, right? You're not going to know if the content that you're creating is really resonating with them until you create the content. But you at least need to know and be clear on who it is that you're speaking to. So connecting with listeners, right? You need to dive deep into topics. Be willing to get vulnerable with stories relevant to the topics to build connection and trust with listeners. Once again, if you don't know who you're speaking to, you may get vulnerable about something that they don't care about, right? You also may have topics that aren't relevant to them. So you're going to have a hard time building connection and trust and keeping that consistency of listeners. You're going to lose listeners because you're going to be having great content, but it's geared towards the wrong person. And when those two things don't align, that's when you feel like your content isn't performing well. Well, no, let's take a step back and look at some things, okay? So that's the first point in connecting with listeners. The second thing, get listener engagement. So as you start to create this content more consistently, share relevant information that relates to the episode, right? So maybe it's a case study, testimonial, current event that makes your topic more digestible and relatable for your listeners. So ask your listeners, what do they like to hear? Or what do they want to hear you talk about, right? There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying every single thing that somebody requests you do, no. But once you start building this show out and as you start to get feedback or want engagement or engage with the people that are listening to you, whether that's on social, through email, in person, whatever, ask them what type of topics do they want to hear. Ask them what do they think about episode so-and-so. Like, hey, I know you're in this industry and I had this person or I was talking about this specific thing on this episode. Did you get a chance to listen to it? If you did, what did you think about it? Would you like to hear more content about that? Help them like shift a little bit and kind of influence a little bit what you're talking about. I'm not saying do that with everybody, but that is one way to get listener engagement. You can just simply create a poll on social media and say, what are some topics you would like to hear from our podcast, right? But that's only going to happen when you've been creating content consistently. So don't do that episode 1, right? I think you should have some episodes under your belt where people understand, okay, she's pretty consistent. She's been doing this for a while. And then you ask them, hey, you've heard all of my content or you've listened at least to a portion of my content. What type of content would you like to hear more of? Right? And then the last point in connecting with listeners is evolve content based on feedback. So this usually happens after you have 10 to 12 episodes worth of data. And so when you have that data, be sure that you're checking that regularly, right? Like schedule time once a week or whatever to review that data. And then once again, you can ask your audience to suggest topics, right? But that's only going to happen when you've been creating that content. And usually it's around the 10 to 12 episode mark. Most podcasts, I think it's about 75% of podcasts, maybe more now, don't make it past 12 episodes. Because 12 episodes, you got to think about it. That's what, 4 months, 4 months, 3.5, 4 months. By that time, people think they're supposed to be rich or they think they're supposed to have all these followers or all these listeners and they don't. And they get discouraged and then they quit. Or they get busy and then they quit. Or it's too overwhelming and then they quit. Or they see how much time it truly takes and then they quit. So if you can make it to 12 episodes, you're already in the top percentage of podcasters because most podcasts don't make it past the 12th episode. Right? So once you've made it to your 12th episode, that's when you can start to ask for feedback and evolve your content based on that feedback. And then finally, the last thing, number 4, call to action. Wrap up your show with a summary of the main points discussed. I'm going to do that in a second. So you're going to get to hear what my call to action is. And listen, a bonus, once you have summed up that show, you can transcribe that and that can be your show notes. That's just a little bonus. With every podcast episode, you're going to need some show notes. And if you're already speaking the show notes or you're already saying a summary, transcribe that summary and use that as your show notes. Simple. Now, you may have to tweak it a little bit. It may not be perfect, but you're going to be about 95% of the way there if you do it that way. That's all I have for y'all today. So The whole point of this show was to show you what goes into launching or relaunching your podcast and throwing out the excuses. Now, all of this stuff may sound overwhelming, and I get it. I have a resource for that in a second. All of this may sound extremely overwhelming, but what I want for us and what I talked about in this podcast is how we can be more consistent in 2024 with our content. There's no longer the age of people that are, let me take a step back. People are now waiting to hear from experts, and you have to be creative in the way that you present that information. You can't just present facts to people. You just can't come out and say, here's 5 ways to buy a house in 2024. No, that's no longer going to grab a lot of people's attention. So you have to be super creative in the ways in which you do that. And the only way for you to understand the best creative way to do that is by starting to create content and then evolving it from that. So today we talked about when you're launching or planning to relaunch a podcast, here are the things that you need to do in order to do that. Determine who you're speaking to and creating a podcast for, planning the podcast content, connecting with listeners, and then what are going to be those call to actions. So that's what we talked about today in this first episode of the Kannon Studios Podcast for 2024. Here's my closing statement. So 2024 is here, y'all. And think about how much further you would be if you started your podcast this time last year. Okay, we thought about it. Now let's throw that out the window because you may have not started it, and that's okay. I don't want you to sit in on that and harp too much on that because that leads to procrastination, and procrastination often leads to inaction. So the best time to start a podcast was about 5 years ago. But the second best time to start is now, and I want to help you do that. So I'm right there with you. I launched this podcast last year, was inconsistent, or I was consistent when I launched, gained clients due to the success of the podcast, and then stopped. Probably like, that didn't make any sense. Now that I'm saying it out loud, you're absolutely right. It doesn't make any sense, which is why I'm committed to releasing at least 52 episodes this year. But this year, I'm committed to the consistency of releasing podcasting content regularly, even when I'm busy or don't want to. So let's make 2024 the year of executing and sharing knowledge with those that need it. So listen, all of this information may be overwhelming, and you may have tried to take notes while you were listening to this. Actually, if I'm thinking through the person that I'm speaking to, they probably weren't sitting at a desk listening to a podcast. They were probably doing something else. Getting the kids ready for something, or maybe they're in the car, maybe they're grocery shopping, maybe they're on their lunch break, whatever that case may be. So they probably weren't sitting at a desk listening to this. So you probably weren't able to take notes, and that's okay. I've created a free resource for you. It's a free blueprint that shows you how to launch your podcast in just 25 minutes. It's preparing you to launch your podcast in 25 minutes. Did you hear that? 25 minutes. For the length of this podcast episode, if you go through this guide, you should be equipped with knowing how to launch your podcast in 25 minutes. And it's all free. I'm going to leave the link to that in the show notes below. And I can't wait for you to access it. I cannot wait for you to access it. I think it's going to be incredibly helpful, and it's going to throw out all the excuses of, I don't know how to do it. That's fine. This guide is going to show you how to do it. It will prepare you to launch your podcast in just 25 minutes, which is about the length of this podcast episode. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. And we can't wait until the next episode. That's it for the Kannon Studios Podcast. Keep creating.